Well, guys, as promised, I have got Michael Fridjhon on the line with me because, as we all know, he is our major domo when it comes to industry commentary, and we are sitting on the edge of a crisis in our industry at the moment. Michael, hi, thanks for joining me on Carrie's Corner.
I'd say we're beyond the edge, a bit like the fiscal cliff that we've been promised for some time and now find ourselves way down the slippery slope. I think the same is now really happening to the liquor industry. And I think the problem is that government is absolutely insensitive to the industry. And because it has an obsession based on fairly sound historical experience, it really doesn't care. And the cost of that is in hundreds of thousands of jobs. And even where those jobs are not lost permanently, it means that there are hundreds of thousands of households which have gone without income for a month. Because most of the liquor industry, in terms of retail, in terms of hospitality, is at the very kind of coalface of social interaction and social consumption. And those are the people whose jobs go the moment there's a lockdown. Their bosses say to them, "We'll see you when we can work again." It's an informal sector. It's fragile employment, and therefore the moment there is any form of restriction on its ability to operate, it's jobs that are lost temporarily and ultimately lost permanently.
Well, of course, you would have seen that SA Breweries lost in their application to the High Court in the Western Cape this week. What's your comment on that?
Well, I haven't read the judgment, so I've got to be reserved about the legal issues that are at stake. But what I can say is that there is a very clear body of evidence, and it increases regularly, that the information that government has been relying upon in order to justify the idea of a liquor ban, and the liquor ban is justified, as you and your listeners will know, on the basis that they want to remove the risk of liquor-related trauma from taking over valuable bed space in hospitals at the time of a COVID wave. And what we are seeing categorically is that the reason that the trauma admissions reduce during these lockdowns has nothing to do with the ban on the sale of alcohol and everything to do with limitations of movement. And that's a very important distinction, because the research has to show that it's the absence of alcohol, not the absence of movement, that is the reason for the reduced trauma admissions. Because if it can show that, then there is no argument. There has to be some restriction on the sale of alcohol. But research which was undertaken last year and has been retested and retested shows that in every other dispensation, so for example, in Ireland, in Britain, in America, wherever there have been lockdowns, trauma admissions have dropped by pretty much the same percentage as they dropped last year when we had liquor lockdown as well as movement lockdown. So what we see is there are two apparent causes, and everywhere else, because liquor wasn't banned anywhere else, that decline in trauma admissions took place in the same percentage. So if you want to shut down a major industry, a major employer, a major source of sustenance to literally hundreds of thousands, in fact, the estimate is probably close to 1 million South Africans depend directly for food and accommodation on the hospitality industry, and specifically on the liquor side of the hospitality industry. If you want to do that, then it behoves government to make a real effort to unpack the 2 points. And what we've seen, and it's occurred even in the latest research from the coterie of anti-alcohol people who work under the auspices of the Medical Research Council. And here we need to unpack some important points. The Medical Research Council gets its money from government, and therefore sadly, it does government bidding. And there are a lot of prohibitionists in government, so it pays these guys who are themselves prohibitionists. Most of the key researchers are members of the South African Alcohol Policy Alliance, which is a body committed to more and more restriction on the sale of liquor. And instead of looking at the regulations which are in place and saying it would be very nice if they were enforced, they have a clear agenda, absolutely expressed in terms of the equivalent of a mission statement, that they wish to see greater restriction on the sale of liquor, and they do not want the liquor industry to be part of any discussion around the regulations that they wish to impose. And they are faking the stats and publishing them. There is no other word to describe it. So, for example, in order to diminish the impact of the limitations of mobility, they take the Google mobility stats, but they focus on residential mobility. Well, that's not showing you whether people are going out socially. It's not showing you whether people are going to the office. By taking the Google mobility stats and limiting them to residential mobility, they are dismissing the impact of the lockdown and curfew on movement in order to finesse it out of their research. And their latest piece of research, where they attempt to prove that the decline in trauma admissions exactly tracks the lockdowns. They have used this very limited definition of mobility. And secondly, they have failed to explain the fact that trauma admissions did not increase in those 2 weeks, late June to roughly mid-July last year, in level 3, when liquor sales were initially permitted and then locked down again. There was a significant decline in trauma admissions, even when liquor was available. So it is very bad science that government is relying upon, and it's doing it in a very cavalier fashion, because while it is listening to people who are singing to the hymn masters, because that's exactly what these researchers are doing, they are producing research which satisfies their own particular agenda, and they know that they are satisfying government agenda. And the point of satisfying the government agenda is that's where they get more research funds from. It's outrageous. And that is the basis on which government has proceeded to include alcohol bans as part of the restrictions of movement that come with the high levels of lockdown.
So, Michael, do you think that government has done anything about researching the amount of inebriation that goes on in townships on weekends, when we know that alcohol is being brewed by many people, as has been done for many, many, many years? And we're led to believe that it's part of traditional law, and it is totally in keeping with the law that this can happen. Just because
you're talking about what is called traditional African beer,
exactly,
which is a separate category of alcohol. You know what? There's a much more serious question. I don't know if they've done any work on that. The same researchers that government relies upon to produce this skewed research claim that roughly 25% of alcohol consumed in South Africa is illicitly produced or illicitly sourced. So 25%. So they cannot firstly assume that when there is a lockdown that officially bans alcohol,
yes,
that there isn't alcohol available, because by their own definitions, 25% of alcohol sales are illicit anyway. So they will go on throughout the lockdown. But what they're in fact doing is empowering the illicit sector, because when you ban something, the underground moves into action. This is a country of criminal networks, sponsored and supported by people in authority. So as they ban the formal liquor industry, they open the doors for the informal and illicit liquor industry, which comes with huge costs. It comes with costs to the employment in the hospitality sector, and it comes with massive costs to the fiscus, which relies upon the liquor industry's excise duty and VAT contributions to a significant extent. So in banning it, all they're doing is opening the door for criminal syndicates exactly as they did with the tobacco ban last year.
Yes. And just have you or anybody that you know, because certainly nobody that I know, have you been invited by government to address or advise or suggest to them how we can try and sort this problem out?
No, I haven't, and I'm not sure that there's been much engagement between government and the formal sector, and that's partly because as I said to you earlier, the agenda of the government's advisors, who are members of the South African Alcohol, Policy Alliance, is very clearly stated that the industry should not have a place at the table when alcohol policy is being discussed. So it's almost a matter of principle within government to disregard the industry and to take advice from people who are agenda driven, but whose agenda coincides and overlaps with the government's. It is also very interesting that these people who are rushing to see ever more draconian regulation in place, no one ever talks about the level of regulation that is presently in place. So, as an example, and I always state it, if a licensee supplies an underage drinker, the maximum penalty is 500,000 Rand fine or 5 years in jail. That's pretty steep. And so it should be. My only point is you don't need to change the regulations. They are in place. What you need to do is to get Becky Tsele and his team of cops who spend, it seems to me, most of their time running a small domestic industry at the side of the road, and certainly weren't on the ground when they needed to be in the last few weeks. Those guys need to be out and about and on the streets and in the townships and in places like Parkhurst. When alcohol is available, believe me, it is available to underage drinkers. No one ever seems to go to court for it.
Yeah, quite right. They're policing the wrong things. What do you believe, if I said to you in your crystal ball, this time next year, where's our industry going to be?
Listen, I think that the events of the last few weeks show that our country is very much at a knife edge, and I guess very much depends on who in the end is running the country, if anybody, in fact, is running the country. But if you were simply to extrapolate from the condition of the industry now, it's not going to be pretty. There will certainly be losses in the production sector, losses of, complete shutdowns, losses in the distribution. There'll be a lot of consolidation, which by its very nature is anti-competitive. And there will be permanent job losses because, as we know, the hospitality sector never regenerated properly after the last lockdown. So it's safe to assume that it won't be in a booming and healthy condition no matter what happens. It's an industry that really needs insight and support and judgment and understanding and engagement, all of which things, sadly, we're not seeing from the present force in government.
I think the other big thing that everybody is failing to remember is that in the wine industry specifically, well, I suppose it's the whole booze industry really, because it all comes from grains or grapes or fruit of some description. It's farming. It's cyclical. You have a harvest time, you have a pruning time, a budding time, a bottling time. They have messed with every single step of the supply chain, from consoles bottling right to the consumer who can no longer buy the product.
I mean, you talk about bottling, but, there's a huge glass shortage at the moment because the lockdowns of last year have left us without glass supplies. And although exports have been doing well, they haven't been doing brilliantly, but they are mopping up quite a lot of the bottles we do have, and the industry is short of bottle stock. Then there are factors that, to be fair, are entirely beyond government control. There's this real shortage of containers and shipping capacity worldwide because of last year's lockdown. So even if the bans were to be lifted, the necessary infrastructure and capacity to take advantage of the commercial prospects isn't immediately available.
Well, I think suffice to say that we need the government on sides from soup to nuts in the industry, and it has to be continuous. It can't be the stop, start, stop, start. The stop, start nature of it. I'm not sure what SA Breweries is going to be doing going forward, but I certainly know if I was the boss of SA Breweries, I would be looking to not be in South Africa, because this must be an absolute nightmare for them. So,
The government is going to read this, and they're not wrong in this. They're going to say, listen, it's still a profitable business. They're not going to leave. And that's partly true, but they're not going to invest.
no,
And ultimately, disinvestment is a way of leaving. It
yeah,
is milking your assets dry and doing whatever business you can at least possible cost. If you want to run your business properly, you have to have a long-term vision, and you have to have an investment strategy that goes with that vision, which in turn means that you have to be confident that you are in a stable operating environment. These are not things which government ever seems to contemplate. I think they're frankly too busy at the trough.
Yep, I think you're quite right. Michael, as ever, you are invaluable when it comes to my corner. Your insights are always so concise, succinct, and we know exactly where we stand when we've listened to Michael Fridjhon. Have a good weekend. Thanks for joining me on Carrie's Corner.
Thank you. All the best. Have a great weekend. You too. Cheers. Bye-bye.
You good?
Good. I'm hanging up.
Luckily,